Picture this. You're defending your dissertation to two past presidents of the American Society of Church History, and one asks you to define mainline Protestantism, the term you've been using throughout your work. And the best answer anyone could give, I think it had something to do with railroads in Philadelphia. Well, today we talk with church historian Elesha Coffman about why defining America's once dominant religious tradition turned out to be harder than anyone expected. She not only learned about the power of periodicals, the role it plays in the church by her time as an early scholar at Church History magazine, eventually Christianity Today, but she's written the definitive book on the Christian century. The central magazine or periodical for mainline Protestantism, and we spend quite a bit of time talking about it and unpacking it and learning just what you can discover about American church history and this part of Protestantism from the discourse, interactions, and figures that shaped it. I hope you enjoy this conversation, because I did, and maybe if you're one of those people who personally has Christian century on their coffee table, or a clergy that does, then maybe you go, oh, I know someone else who's a reader. I bet they'll dig this, because the best brew is a shared brew. All right? Well, thank you, Dr. Coffman, for joining the podcast, and thank you all for listening. It's a blast to get to do this. Enjoy. Hello, everyone. This is Tripp, and today on the podcast, Elesha Coffman, American church historian, and pretty excited to have you on here. I think you might be the only person who's written an entire book about the Christian century.
Yes, certainly the only one on your podcast, and also probably the only one, period.
Yeah, I mean, the internet didn't even know about someone else that has written an entire book on the Christian century. Also, a recent book on turning points in American church history, which in the Mark Knoll format, which was exciting and fun to do. Well, but I'm working on a series with a host of different American church history scholars, and so I thought a place to begin was to hear a bit about your motivation for studying American church history. In the beginning of your recent book, you said not many people feel a burning need to know about American church history. And so I wonder if you could elaborate on why you think it's essential for both Christians and non-Christians to understand about America's relationship to church history broadly, for understanding the present and where we've come from.
Yeah, I came by probably an unusual path. Grew up going to churches, went to a Christian college, but then right after I was at Wheaton College, and then I was interning and then working full-time at Christianity Today, publishing up the road from Wheaton in the Chicago suburbs. And so one editorial, I was in the online services department at the birth of the internet. And then I was briefly at Campus Life magazine, because that was the only editorial job available. And then I found myself as the assistant editor of Christian History magazine that they were publishing at the time, and realized that I didn't know any church history, that had just not been communicated to me growing up evangelical. There was one class at Wheaton, but my section of it wasn't very good. I just didn't know anything about this church history. And yet I was editing the magazine, and then almost immediately the managing editor left for another position in the company. So I was completely in charge of their quarterly magazine on Christian history, despite not knowing anything about it. And I said I should probably, take a class in this. So they sent me back down the road to take Mark Knoll's church history survey, and then I took another couple classes in it. And it was so interesting to me realizing that there were lots of different ways to be Christian. It would be nice if I'd figured that out after undergrad, but I really hadn't. Small town Indiana to Wheaton College, I'd pretty much been told that there was one way to read the Bible, there was one way to structure a church, there was one way to do missions. I knew a little bit of variety. I knew that the Nazarene kids I grew up around couldn't wear shorts in the summer, like stuff like that, but no sense of why these differences existed, or really how big of a tent Christianity was, that people had done things really differently in different times and different places, that there were different perspectives on whether women could be ministers, that there were different perspectives on how Christians and churches as institutions should be functioning in the political sphere. And so it was really intriguing and empowering for me. That was how I got interested in the subject, as well as I was thinking about grad school. I'd been an English lit major. I'd looked at a couple grad schools at English literature and just decided those were not my people. Those were not my questions. But I had Mark Knoll as my professor for the church history class, and I wrote a paper for his class on Dante because we were doing an issue on Dante for the magazine, and he just wrote on the margin of the paper, like, maybe you should go to grad school in this. And so before my GRE scores expired, I switched fields and applied in church history instead.
Well, there's that is some a very efficient guidance from a mentor. As someone who's been in a host of different teaching locations where when you're on religion faculties, you get assigned all sorts of different classes that are tangential to your area of expertise as someone that, wrote on 20th century American religion. What kind of things did you learn as you either in the classroom or in your more recent book started to explore your area of expertise in relationship to the larger picture of church history?
I sometimes when I get bored in meetings, I will try to remember all the different classes that I've been asked to teach in my 3 different institutions. It's 26 at last count, and that's church history, everything from early and medieval, Reformation and modern when I was at University of Dubuque Theological Seminary. But 2 of my 3 jobs have just been history jobs. So I've done colonial US and US women's and sports in American history. That was super fun. I only got to teach that once. My main class here at Baylor is food history. And so the part of your earlier question that I forgot to ask, like, why does everybody need to know about church history? It touches on so many different topics, whether you're interested in it as a church person, as a person of faith, as a person with some questions about your faith. That was more like my entry point. But if you're trying to understand US colonization and US policy toward Native nations and the history of slavery, like anything that you want to understand or need to understand, there's lots of things that it's more of a need to know, I think, to be able to function as a educated citizen, responsible citizen in a democracy. The history of American Christianity touches on and informs all of that. And so it comes up that various topics come up in my US history classes, whereas a lot of US history came up in my church history classes. That was the part that was a little weird in the seminary context, that I kept wanting to talk not just about church polity, not just about history of theology, but about gender and enslavement and use of the land and all these other historical topics, because to me, it's all part of a big complicated story that we are all part of too. And if I'm going to be part of a story, I'd like to understand what's going on in that story.
Yeah, yeah, and I wonder if there's a sense and I noticed this difference in even how those same classes get taught here than when I was working at the University of Edinburgh, where while religion plays a smaller role in the public square there, it plays a bigger role in national identity and cultural framework, and there's not the ongoing boundary maintenance of what you teach or don't teach in, quote, secular classes. So, even our kids, they're super young there, have religion classes in school. And the divinity school in Edinburgh, I got there and was like, there are 800 and some divinity students. And they're like, that's all the religion majors and masters and PhD students. And 23 of them are going to be clergy. I was like, oh, you call it a divinity school? That's weird, right? And in that experience, there's this sense that for them, even the Muslim students or atheist students see the Scottish religious history as part of their nation's history. And one of the things that shows up in both the Turning Points book and in the Christian Century book is a sense that the kind of the separation between church and state and the multiplicity of denominations in American church history means there's less of a cultural reservoir of religious identity for students, and the familiarity, say, like beyond your own denominational background, right? Like I showed up in undergrad and I knew we didn't like Free Will Baptists, but I didn't know why, because we were the right type of Baptist, but I wouldn't have known that a Methodist wasn't in another religion. It's a, rural North Carolina for you. And so I wonder, like, how you see that unique elements of national identity playing out in American religion, where when we kind of mute or sidetrack the religious conversation, you have a rather incomplete account of even American history, because there's not that kind of shared religious narrative from our history that the country kind of connects to.
It's hard to say that there's any kind of shared narrative about American religion, American
Yeah.
religious history, or American history even right now. With my undergrads here at Baylor, Baylor obviously is a Christian institution. All faculty must be active members of Christian or Jewish faith communities. Students don't have any faith requirement at all. And so we get some that are very firmly grounded in Christian religious traditions, some that are not so firmly grounded in Christian religious traditions, some who would identify as nuns, a very small percentage who are Muslim or Jewish or some other faith. But you can't make assumptions about them in the classroom. And so it's interesting to hear you saying that. I don't assume that my undergrads here either have a basic functioning knowledge of U.S. history or any firm grounding in a religious tradition, accurate or otherwise. You could have a very firm grounding and think a lot of things about your own tradition or other traditions that are just wrong. Yeah, I just don't know. It's just a real mixed bag. Sometimes there are then students who will push back that I'm telling them something that's different than what they heard, either in their religious upbringing or their academic upbringing. Less often now. I remember, I think it was my first semester here. I was just teaching a U.S. history survey, U.S. since 1877 survey, and a student came up to me, a student of color, who thanked me for being the first teacher he'd ever had to explain that the Civil War was caused by slavery. He was from Christian schools in East Texas, and like that he knew that, but no teacher had ever said that. And so that's just one example of I try not to ever assess my students on what they should have learned elsewhere, because some of them have been steered very wrong.
Yeah. One of the elements that, comes across in the Turning Points book is, unlike, the different parts of Europe where the kind of colonial groups came from, where you had a lot more homogeneity in the particular nation states, what part of the Reformation or whether they remained Catholic and this kind of thing they came from. The unique situation of pluralism was an ongoing contested element in early American religion. And it also is set up in a colonial context where you have both native populations, the slave trade, and everything going in it. And then this nation that gets born after all these different threads are, trying to figure out, what's going on. So I wonder, when you're thinking about both the history of the church in America, what are the main connection points you see religion playing or amplifying in the different communities that are kind of pre-birth of the nation?
I think that we as Americans may overestimate the cultural uniformity of European countries. Have to remind myself that, like, Italy as we know it is a creation of the 1870s. Like, I
Yeah.
think of European culture, European countries and European cultures taking the shape that I know from maps. And that really isn't necessarily the case. I think if you're from any of those, but the way that in the United States, like, Vermont is not Alabama. And we all instinctively know that. I'm sure that's true of two places in Italy, two places in France, two places in the UK, in just ways that I have to remind myself it isn't so patently obvious in food cultures and religious inclinations and political leanings and stuff like that. All of that said, the US is a bigger and in many ways more complicated place than at least European nations, like China, India, Russia. That's a whole nother thing. But United States is really big, really different religious cultures, as you said, at the earliest times with the native nations, many of which we know so little about because of the rapid spread of disease after European contact. A lot of that idea that Europeans had that, oh, this land is just vacant because everybody died before you got there and you never knew that. The disease traveled so much faster than the Europeans themselves did. So by the time they were setting eyes on it and writing stuff down, the literal landscape and the human landscape was already radically transformed. It was important to me to start the Turning Points book not with English Puritans. I could have started with Columbus. I probably should have it. At the time that I started writing the book, when I was at University of Dubuque, in my own course, I had to do Reformation, whatever I wanted to say about modern Europe, and US church history all in a 12-week semester. And so I would have just like the lesson before my 2 weeks on US would have been English Reformation. So that's part of why Turning Points then starts with the defeated Spanish Armada to try to connect both Spanish colonization of the Americas and what was going on in England, because that would have made a very specific kind of sense in that very specific lecture. Now it's just, I get to start with naval warfare, which is probably not what people are expecting and nothing that I knew about before I started writing it.
But it is exciting, you know.
Yeah.
Most church historians aren't like, do you want to hear about the destruction of an armada? Normally we have to go to like weird apocalyptic texts to get anything too exciting in our lectures.
Yeah, I got ships being set on fire and just like set off on the tide. And I had people shipwrecking because they had bad maps and then getting clubbed to death ashore. Like, yeah, that was a lot to deal with. But yeah, it was not a foregone conclusion that the United States would be an English speaking, predominantly Protestant country at all. And there's lots of parts of the current US that have always had a lot of non-English speakers, have always had a lot of non-Protestants. The border crossed them rather than the other way around. That is even more important in my teaching context here in Texas than it was previously in Iowa or Pennsylvania, where although students come from different places and with different narratives, we just have to be conscious of the border in the Southwest and the residual Spanish influence here in Texas in ways that were not as self-evident in Dubuque.
Yeah. It seems true for a friend of mine teaching in New Orleans,
Mm.
where the whole Creole context sets up for different features you bring up just to make sense of the different kind of religious syncretism and diversity you see in their modern context. One of the things that I find interesting when you're thinking about American church history is the transition before what happens before the world wars and after, because the role of a lot of denominations prior, as they're emerging and such prior to the world wars, they remain connected to the nation states they came from, right? So you have multiple Lutheran denominations based on the language they spoke and such. And then after the world wars, you get these combinations of different denominations, a move towards English liturgy, and the birth of what kind of like mainline Protestantism's at least self-image and such as the dominant collective of religion in America. And I wonder how that, like, in that shift of where of moving in the late 19th and early 20th century, what are the biggest shifts that help understand for us today, looking back and going, mainline Protestants would have called themselves like the centerpiece of American religion? How in the world does that make sense? Like, now they just subscribe to the New York Times and don't expect anyone there to even understand mainline religion. So it like when you think of our present day and the nostalgia that kind of boomers and olders have about mainline Protestantism, can you help us understand those kind of like major shifts or turning points that birthed it, to help us get the kind of consciousness that for those younger of us have no idea how to make sense of?
So there were a lot of questions packed in there, and I'll try to weave my way through some of them. I might forget some piece, and then you can remind me of it. The process of church traditions, especially coming from Europe, although this is true from elsewhere, there were some times of major connection or rupture between those immigrant Christians and their home countries, whatever. But it's also a process that happened at different times within different religious traditions. And often what you'd see, especially like I'm thinking like Orthodox churches in the US, which is a tiny slice of things, but an interesting test case in part because most of the Orthodox initially came across the Pacific rather than the Atlantic. You get some interesting melting pot places like Galveston, Texas, but these churches that had strong national characters, languages, worship practices back in their home countries, if there's a small number of immigrants subscribing to some related body of traditions, they would often meet all together at once at the beginning. And then once they had a critical mass, or once there was a new infusion of American Catholic Church, when you go from having a bunch of German Catholics in some area to having a bunch of Italian Catholics who came later, or Irish Catholics, then they'll separate back out into ethnic groups, linguistic groups. All the Lutherans will kind of meet together, and then no, now there's enough Swedes and Norwegians, and so we won't anymore. Or over the summer, I visited Swedes Church in Philadelphia, which is an Episcopal congregation. And I was asking someone afterward, like, I don't think of the Swedes as being particularly Episcopalian. And it was way back. They had decided that it made more sense for them to have worship in English, and they didn't feel it had been a Lutheran congregation at the very outset. They didn't feel as connected to other Lutherans as they did to English speaking, roughly similar church structure. So they just went with Episcopalian instead. So yeah, that's a process that these different religious groups went through, not necessarily at the same time. There was one of those points of rapid transition, late 19th, early 20th century, as you were saying, when we went from an era of very high immigration, 1880s to 1920, 1924, right after World War I. There was a lot more xenophobia during World War I. This was on the University of Dubuque, which was the German Presbyterian seminary of Iowa. Everyone in Iowa had to stop using German for any purposes, public or private or religious, during World War I because of anti-German feeling. And so all of University of Dubuque's like library holdings and their own little seminary newsletter just suddenly switched from German to English right during World War I because German was illegal. After we had the high period of immigration and then the new immigration laws that shut down a lot of immigration streams from 1920s to the Hart-Celler Act in 65. So you have this chunk of time in the middle of the 20th century where there's not a lot of new people coming in. And it was in historiography, it was the American Consensus School, a lot of thinking about what does it mean to make us Americans, all us being in quotes, Americans being like it's a definitional time, it's a gatekeeping time, it's a what's the center kind of time. That was also sort of the high point of what we came to know as the Protestant Mainline, which wasn't called that by anybody until the 60s because they didn't think they needed a name. They thought, well, we're American Christianity. We go back to the Congregationalists, the Puritans. Again, that history that I didn't want to tell in my Turning Points book, as if like, well, everybody knows what it means to be American and Christian. Well, in the middle of the 20th century, a lot of everybody did think they knew what it meant to be American and Christian, and for all kinds of reasons of social class and educational attainment and political connections. And we still see vestiges of this. Like, there's way more Episcopalians in the Senate than like in the country. Episcopal Church is not that big. It never was that big. But the
Yeah.
National Cathedral is Episcopal. The
Mhm.
preacher who was in Trump's face at the inaugural, like, they occupy this space on the cultural and political landscape. They still do it, even though their numbers are way down. So today we can look at something like the Episcopal Church or the National Council of Churches kind of denominations, the Protestant Mainline, and we know both. Yeah, you expect them to be the big steeple church downtown. You expect those clergy to be prominent in your city. You expect them to have a certain kind of cultural weight. And you also know that big steeple church downtown doesn't have enough people to maintain the roof. There's this big box church out in the suburbs that looks like a Best Buy that that's where the people are, that both of those things are true. And both of those things were kind of true at mid-century as well. The suburbs were burgeoning evangelicals and non-mainline tradition. And that's not even to talk about American Catholics, who were the other viable case in the middle of the 20th century. Like, well, isn't to be an American and Christian, like, shouldn't the first thing that comes to mind there be Catholic? They'd been the biggest denomination in the US since the mid-19th century, but they didn't have the same kind of cultural power. They were more ethnic, they were more regionally concentrated. But yeah, there was an expectation. When you think of American Christianity, what's the first thing that comes to mind? Mid-20th century, it was some kind of mainline Protestant. Now it probably isn't, and numerically shouldn't be the first thing that comes to your mind.
I don't know. I just got back from a month in Europe, and I'll just say that none of them thought of mainline Protestantism when they think of American Christians. They mostly just apologize to you for having to deal with Christians. And then you try to decide if you want to tell them if you're a theology professor or not. And they're like, so what are you doing here? And you're like, this is not when you tell them after they apologize for your entire country that you're teaching a week-long class and theology in their nation and it was significantly different this time than even Trump's last time in office when I was teaching abroad there. I think him not winning the popular vote just meant they were like, look, Americans had they got a really kind of screwed up way they select a president. Now they're like, they're just really screwed up, and I'm sorry for you. It's something. In your book on the Christian century, one of the parts that's hard in using the particular magazine story to tell a story about mainline Protestantism and its changes overall is it's just hard to define what the mainline is or was in general. And it seemed that you used a number of different dimensions to it, both like, okay, well, here's some denominations that broadly are, or here's a mode of religiosity, right? Like they'll probably next to a university at a big thing downtown, or it's a social network because they all are connected to these major schools where they went to seminary and all their clergy are friends, and then they go through the National Council of Churches and blah, blah, blah. Or like they have this sense of cultural capital or whatever that running through them. I wonder, as someone who both like wrote a book on it and then has had time to interact with other people engaging it and other historians talking about it, like what are the actual features where mainline Protestantism is a useful term for something about the past, and are any of them still true, right? And what makes me ask this still true is there's only two denominations of the mainline Protestant ones that show up on most lists that actually had a majority of their congregants vote Democrat in the last election, right? And which is completely unlike their clergy. I don't think we worry about what mainline clergy voted. If they voted red, it's more likely the DSA than the Republican Party. But obviously what mainline Protestantism was in the past isn't the same it is today, but defining it and seeing is kind of necessary to see its changes. So I wonder how that conversation plays out with your peers and how that definition's been refined since people kind of engaged the book.
Yeah, that question came up in my dissertation prospectus defense. So for any of your listeners who have not done a PhD in religion or history, one of the things you do, you take some classes, and then you take some kind of comprehensive exams about your classes. And then usually the next checkpoint is you decide the committee of roughly 5 faculty members who are going to be reading your dissertation and deciding if you get your PhD or not. And you pitch your project to them. Like, this is what I want to write about and why. I had been a journalist at Christianity Today between undergrad and grad school. I had decided that I wanted to write about religious magazines for a dissertation because that was something that I already kind of knew something about, and so I could bring a fresh perspective. But I didn't want to write about the world that I came from. I didn't want to have that much of an insider-outsider thing that I had to try to navigate. So I went adjacent to that. Christianity Today's arch rival, Christian Century, crosstown rival, suburban to downtown in Chicago. And so I'm at my prospectus defense. I have 2 past presidents of the American Society of Church History on my committee. My committee changed a little bit. Mark Noll was on there, even though he wasn't at Duke. Grant Wacker was my advisor. And then I had a historian from UNC Chapel Hill, Fitzhugh Brundage, who was a historian of, I'd taken readings courses in U.S. cultural history with him, late 19th, 20th century, but he was not a historian of religion. And he asked in the defense, so you keep using that term mainline. What does that mean? And again, I've got 2 past presidents of the American Society of Church History there. And the best they've got was Mark Knoll saying, I think it had something to do with railroads in Philadelphia. I'm like, okay. If this is,
That is such a fun story. And I need to add that to my list of questions to ask people is what was the most awkward conversation during your dissertation defense? Like where you're trying to do your prospectus, because I think everyone that's done it immediately thought of theirs. That's at least like I just remember sitting there going, yeah, and that chapter might not be in the final version. It will just be in the published version because I don't want to wade into an argument between all these people.
that wasn't, it wasn't awkward for me. It was just like, oh my gosh, uh, the field needs a definition of this. If people love people who you think would know, don't actually know, like this is something I can contribute. And when I started doing that research and making conference presentations, as a little grad student, I would tell people like, when you walk out of this room after I've told you what I found, you will know more about the definition of the mainline. Like, this is my gift to you. I'll give you everything I got on it because like nobody knows. It did have something to do with railroads in Philadelphia. It was E. Digby Baltzell writing about American social class, and it was about the ritzy suburbs of Philadelphia. I went on the main line for the first time this summer when I was back in Philly doing archival research. It's like I finally made it 20 years later. What was written about the main line then, I was starting this research in like 2006. It was mostly from a theological perspective. Gary Dorian's written a bunch about this, some other people. And I was at Duke, not in the divinity school, but my advisor's position was in Duke Divinity, which is a Methodist divinity school. So like very mainline. And the Methodist Church has always had both conservative and liberal. It's regional, it's big city, little city. It's complicated, but Duke was a mainline Methodist kind of place. And so the assumption is like, well, by mainline, we mean this kind of liberal theology. And I don't really like reading theology as part of it, but I just like that didn't make sense to me, especially because of the clergy lay divide that you were mentioning, which was also well known. Like, if you mean mainline, that as if you're defining mainline as liberal theology, then you can only talk about mainline clergy and national leadership and like meetings at the National Council of Churches. And there was a guy that I met early on who had been to National Council of Churches meetings as a delegate for his denomination. And he told me, oh yeah, the people who go to that, the conversations we're having at that national meeting about liberal theology, liberal political orientation, we're having those conversations in that room because we can't have them back in our congregations. Like it never, that kind of liberal theology and political orientation never penetrated from the top ranks of clergy, national bodies, national leadership, down to even smaller churches, let alone laity. So then if you want to talk about the mainline more at the congregational level or as the whole denominational level, then something ties them together other than particular points of liberal theology. So then what is it? Is it worship style? That's a big part of it. The aesthetics of those churches still. I'm a choral musician. I am finicky about the sound of a worship service. I don't do praise choruses. I don't do bad acoustics. I don't do bad miking. I want a hymnal in my hand. And I'm extra persnickety about that. But that is part of it. Like what the look and feel of it, the type of building, the type of people who were there, the general education level, the racial makeup for sure. That's all part of it. And then also just the structures, the polity. Most lay people don't know about their polity, how their clergy ranks are formed and what their clergy training is. But boy, do their clergy know. And they know how their pension plan works. And that matters to them. That was something I found in the Christian Century book when the editor of the Christian Century, Charles Clayton Morrison, who was Canadian originally, he saw the United Church of Canada forming and saying, well, we got to do that in the US, both because he hated Catholics and he thought unified Protestantism would be better able to face off against Catholicism. And he just thought it was redundant. And why are we competing against each other? We should all unite as one church. And so they're teasing out plans for that in the Christian Century magazine, most of the subscribers of the Century were clergy, and they're immediately writing in being like, well, who's going to sign my pension check? Who's going to,
Oh,
which
yeah.
seminary training is going to count here? And so just the institutional structures and heft of the Mainline, again, not to all the laity and not to their voting patterns, but to the clergy, those kind of things really matter. That's what ties them together even more than, well, I believe exactly this about the inspiration of scripture or something like that.
To me, it's such a fascinating history to think through because whatever assumptions clergy or denominational leaders make about it have quite the operational power in how they work with each other or how they think about even addressing stuff in the present, right? So, like, it would make too much sense for the mainline Protestant denominations now to decide to reorganize how they use labor, investment, property, resources to be more efficient. But a lot of those long time boundaries that clergy, namely the clergy who grow up in a denomination, become its clergy and its denominational leaders, those are like the only people in a gathering that know why the Protestant, like why Episcopals aren't Lutheran, right? Like there's so many, like who those denominations select in advance for leadership are like the few, the proud, the distinctively X, Y, and Z. And then you get all these institutions and congregations in survival mode when a different form of cooperation in the same city, you'd have critical mass and support structure and all sorts of things, right? So the almost like during the Christian century, there was too much success in those denominations to need a cooperation that they've now entrenched to rather blinding levels. Like just as someone that moved to a new city and wish there was a vibrant mainline Protestant congregation with not crappy children's stuff and a worship service where my kids wouldn't fall asleep, I'm like, can't y'all like, after visiting 20 of them, and you're like, but if all the families were in one place, you might not get to worship and realize you're the only one there, you know? Anyway, that's just trip venting about how much I wish they organized differently. But I wonder if like you could talk a bit about that notion of cultural capital, because regardless of what it refers to, what Christian century refers to and what was in the imagination, it's that it represented a kind of cultural capital as foundation to the birth of the magazine, but also the birth, like kind of like the use of mainline as a label, going forward.
Yes. My degree is religion rather than history, so I have a little bit of theory. I had a little bit of exposure to theory in grad school. That this was actually what the members of my dissertation committee argued about more than anything else, because I ended up with historians of religion, a theology person, because for internal reasons I needed another member of the Duke Divinity faculty, and he was the only one who was available, a sociologist, a religious studies person, and a historian not of religion. And one of the questions, I had more theory from Pierre Bourdieu as well as communication theory of James W. Carey in the
Oh,
dissertation.
fun.
Yeah. And the one religious studies person was like, you really got to do more with the Bourdieu. And all the historians were like, no, it needs to be in the footnotes. I do not want to read that man's name in your text. I do not want any theoretical concepts. But when I found that, it helped me understand this cultural capital piece. And again, I was trying to get beyond just the theological precepts of stuff, because I've never been convinced that really matters as much to most people as centered church history texts would lead you to believe. Education was huge. Whether people, and especially in the early 20th century when going to college or any kind of seminary training was far more rare, my early Christian century guys all wrote autobiographically of how big a deal it was. Some of their fathers were even clergy, but like Charles Clayton Morrison's father, he was Disciples of Christ, which is an interesting denomination within this whole matrix, much closer to the grassroots than, say, the Episcopal Church. His father thought that all you needed to preach was the Bible, that the Bible interpreted itself. You didn't need to know any languages. You didn't need to know any commentaries. You didn't need to know anything about history of biblical era or intervening, just like the Bible was clear. Morrison goes to college, and then he's at the University of Chicago, which was really the hotbed of scholarship, modernist scholarship, early 20th century, putting the Bible in conversation with all these other academic disciplines and texts to see it differently. All of those guys, the early editors, the early contributors to the century were like, oh yeah, I went away to college and I read these books and I met these different people and I really admired my professors. I started to look at my professors as father figures, sometimes more than my own father. Sort of realized I can never go home again in a lot of ways. Like I now know things. I'm a different person than I was. Christian Century readers, that the clergy who would write in the 20s, 30s, talking about going to seminary and then going out into ministry out in the hinterlands somewhere. They felt so isolated. They missed college. They missed seminary. They missed that cultural world. So that education is cultural capital. It gives you a certain kind of credibility. Well, it used to, back when expertise was valued in this country. You could be divinity trained and then you can hobnob with the lawyers and doctors in town. And like you were all kind of equals. That was a cultural capital. But aesthetics as well. The early Christian Century guys had boxes at the opera in Chicago. The Century magazine would write about art and architecture and literature. So again, the aesthetic side of worship, which we now think about with the mega churches and the sound systems and the worship music, but it's always been important. It's just what good church music was has that definition has changed. It used to be having a great organ and choir in robes, and mainline churches had that.
When you think of the story of like Charles Clayton Morrison and his vision, in the book you talk about how his kind of vision for Christian Century evolved over time and how he had this moment of understanding that it was kind of speaking to versus speaking for this constituency. Can you kind of share a bit more about him? Because I mean, he's not a popular figure in most, surveys of American religious history, but the impact of the century is significant, and it's still the most likely magazine to be unopened on a mainline Protestant clergy's desk when you walk in the office.
Yeah, having it on the desk or on the coffee table. I happened to find this treasure trove of letters. And this I really might get distracted and not come back to your question. So keep me honest on this. When I was doing the dissertation research, writing about a periodical, usually the essentially missing piece is reader response. You just don't know. Maybe you have letters to the editor, but I've been a magazine editor. We edit those. We sometimes wrote them ourselves. Like that is one kind of access to readers, but very limited. Um, Charles Clayton Morrison became editor of the Christian Century in 1908. And then in 1928, he was in Europe trying to generate support for the Kellogg-Briand Pact to outlaw international war. He thought if enough countries signed on and promised that they would never make war again, then we wouldn't have a repeat of World War I. Again, 1928, we know how that played out. But he was gone from the office. That was the main thing. On his 20th anniversary as editor. And his friends back at the office said, wouldn't it be cool if we asked every Christian Century subscriber to send him a note of congratulation and tell him how much the magazine means to them? So they put a piece of letterhead in every single copy of the magazine, and thousands of people wrote back. And this was not letters to the editor for publication. This was like their heartfelt greeting to this guy, and talking about, among the things they talked about was what they did with the magazine when it came to, did they read it right away? I was taking notes on all of this. These letters are in the special collections library at the University of Chicago. They're not digitized. And there were rules on how many images I could request. So I'm just taking notes in this 55-degree room with my fingers freezing, trying to get all the information that I can. They would talk about keeping it on the coffee table because that was a signal to any other visitors that I'm this kind of pastor, whether they read it or not. They would usually say, I do read it and I read this part first, or I only read a little bit every night, because they were so lonely out there in North Dakota. That was their little dose of seminary world that they would parcel out throughout the week. So Morrison, he started it as a Disciples of Christ periodical. That was his religious background. And he wanted to contend for the heart and soul of that church. He wanted it to be more liberal, more educated, more progressive. And there was just a small group of disciples ministers who were college or seminary trained. And they weren't really going to win those fights in their denomination. By his own account, he started to notice in the 20s that there were a lot of subscribers to the magazine who weren't disciples of Christ. The biggest group other than disciples by then was Methodist, in part because it's just such a big church. But then there were also Episcopalians and Presbyterians and a variety. And so he started to think of his audience as the Christian intelligentsia of all the churches. He didn't mean all the churches. He didn't mean Catholics. He didn't mean anything that we would now recognize as evangelical or fundamentalist, although he wouldn't have thought there was any intelligentsia there either. And he and the other editors would usually think of the magazine speaking both to and for that group. They were their people. They knew some of them personally. They'd been to the same handful of divinity schools. But occasionally the Century would make some statement about something and get a bunch of pushback and have to realize, oh, actually, we're out over our skis here. The let's merge all the churches plan was one of those. Before that, it was a battle within the disciples' denomination about baptism, whether they recognize baptism from other traditions. And the Century's like, of course we do. And all these and of course we do. And every disciples minister thinks so. And they listed all these names, and a bunch of guys on there were like, you didn't ask me. And actually, no, I don't agree with that at all. And the Century would be like, oh, sorry. Yeah, we thought we were speaking both to and for, and we weren't. The last time with that, that the United States entered World War II in the early 40s was one where the Century found itself crosswise with a bunch of its constituents, as well as with Reinhold Niebuhr, who had been a contributor to the magazine and then left in a huff. The last one I talked about in my book, which only went up to about 1960, was Billy Graham. The writers for the Christian Century, including a very young Martin Marty, thought that Billy Graham's gospel, his whole roadshow, was setting the cause of the church back, that this was a bad thing, that no right-thinking Christian could possibly support this shallow, crass, materialistic, simplistic biblicism. And the Century's own readers were like, step off. Everybody loves Billy Graham except you. What is wrong with you? And then the Century again was in this position of, oh, we thought we were speaking for, I guess we're only speaking to. Oops.
Yeah, and I wonder if that kind of disconnect, right, where in many ways they were speaking for the actual clergy of denominations pretty often, where like Karl Barth, Reinhold Niebuhr both thought Billy Graham was ridiculous, shallow, and shouldn't count as a gospel, right? So like, when you think of the major and Paul Tillich, so like the three biggest theologians in the of the 20th century that were assigned at mainline Protestant schools, all three of them have notorious quips about the uselessness of Billy Graham's articulation of the gospel. And all the people that had their classes, could pick that up while still ministering to people who went to the Billy Graham crusade, right? And like, so it's someone that's like seeing the intricacies of this story and also thinks about the larger American story and religion's role in it. What is there to learn both about the history, but also about that dichotomy between the leadership of any religious movement, denomination, or collective, and the layman or the grassroots side of it? Or is that like tension something that runs throughout, you think, American church history into the present, or is the mainline example, more of an aberration?
This is something I've thought about a lot. Even to say that Karl Barth, Reinhold Niebuhr, and Paul Tillich were the leading theologians of their era. Like, yeah, their books were read in seminary. And yeah, those
and
guys
on the front of Time magazine.
They were on the cover of Time magazine, which I used to think of as more of it's not just in this little mainline world, like it's in the regular, normal world. Henry Luce, I think, the editor of Time, his dad was a mainline missionary. Time was actually closer to inside that world than I initially realized. Another class I had in grad school, I was another professor down at UNC. It was like the religious books that you're never going to read in a class. It was the bestsellers. It was the stuff that like normal Americans were aware of, while a handful of seminary guys were reading Tillich and Barth. And it was a completely different lineup. Billy Graham was on there. Fundamentalists were on there. A memoir from a Catholic woman. I can't remember exactly what the lineup was, but yeah, there was no overlap at all between religious bestsellers and all of the books that were referenced in my history books, all of the things that I had been taught to think were important and leading. Bishop Fulton Sheen was super important. He was Catholic, but he was on TV, so other people are watching him. Like, so within the 20th century, not just the mainline, there's been popular religious voices, traditions, authors that were different from elite. But I don't know if I try to think earlier than that, like 19th century, 18th century. I'm reading right now a group biography of the Beechers, which is really interesting. Lyman Beecher and Harriet Beecher Stowe and Catherine Beecher and the whole mess of them, they had theological training and ideas. They were also involved in all these cultural causes. They were also front page news in the New York Times. Was that more that regular laity and small church pastors and the elite seminary professors were more on the same page than, at least within those Protestant denominations of the 19th century and basically middle to upper class? I think it's possible that they were more on the same page than the 20th century people that I'm familiar with. But my 20th century expertise makes me wonder, yeah, but were they really? At the seminary, when I had to teach Reformation, we're reading Martin Luther's stuff and you're expecting to extract certain theological principles from it. And then you read about his response to the peasant rebellion. And I, again, as a 20th century person and as an individual who doesn't really like theology, like, so what was it that was really animating people to support or not support him? Was it his doctrine of grace? Or was it the way he smacked down the peasants? Like, I don't know that the doctrine stuff ever really mattered to that many people. My assumption is going to be something else was driving it. It was something about economics. It was something about political power. It was something about personal identity, national identity, people wanting answers to their questions, which are often not abstractly theological. Chronologically, the other way, more recent than my mid-century mainline people, I don't think there's nearly as much of a disconnect between elite clergy, small town clergy, and laity in contemporary evangelicalism. Like, I think they are much more likely to vote the same way. There's still a difference. Evangelical clergy, less likely to be Trump supporters than evangelical laity. The editors of Christianity Today, never Trumpers. Like, top to bottom, never Trumpers. Christianity Today isn't really the evangelical flagship magazine anymore. If it ever was, that's a whole nother are we speaking to for thing. But I think there's always been less of a disconnect in American evangelicalism than there was in the mainline, in part because of differential education. You can be evangelical clergy certainly without a PhD, with barely any seminary training at all. There isn't that kind of distance between them. And I think there are other reasons that it's less of a divide there too. But that's more me going with my gut than having actually studied it.
Yeah. Yeah, I've always wondered that, just because when you track the best-selling religious books and such, it's wild. Last year I taught a seminar in theology of culture at Luther, and they read Tillich and The Courage to Be, which was reprinted 40 some times, like in 2 years. That's like nuts. You know, like when you just think of what would have to occur for any mainline Protestant religious related text to get reprinted that many times in a couple of years is wild. And but you brought up that kind of like the letters to the editor setting up this isolation thing, and that as a way of seeing the gap that existed then and it being different in the present. One of the things I've noticed since 2016, but really since lockdown, and just all the messages I get for everyone related to the podcast. So we'll do our big event each year. We'll have, after lockdown has sold out every time, and we keep getting bigger spaces. So like there'll be like 600 people there. 20-30% of them are going to be clergy who feel lonely, mainline clergy who come feeling lonely because they don't feel at home in their own congregation from all over. You're going to have another third of them who probably live somewhere there's not a more progressive church they can go to and feel safe or whatever, and maybe left in 2016 or in lockdown over like COVID stuff or whatever. And they're like, I want to be in the flesh with human beings. And all these people found the different podcasts and stuff that come, and they go in person. Or we'll do 6 classes a year, with 2,000-3,000 people in it, and a third of them are going to be clergy. They're like, I just want to be able to interact with people because I can't even talk about any of the stuff I learn very often at churches, or always have to be so nuanced or whatever. And you get this sense that there are the other 20% of evangelicals that feel increasingly alienated from their tradition, looking for a community. And then you have all of these kind of mainline Protestant leaders that are like, all my best friends I met in seminary, and we used to like read books and talk about stuff. And now I just need to sound like Morning Joe with a little Jesus sauce on top. But no one really is going to spend more than 2 hours a month on their religious identity. So it's kind of boring. And I don't know if we make a difference. I just need a posture on the right issues, but not the wrong ones, because that would be too controversial, even if they seem clear to me ethically. Does that make sense? Like, it seems to me that dynamic of kind of how collective self-understanding and then how it plays out in different parts of the country and in different denominations and churches is kind of a running experiment. And the thing I hear from evangelical clergy regularly is that, they used to be from the 90s to today, politics and the culture wars became so upstream of religious identity that instead of saying, oh, well, we're trying to lead on, public funding for Christian schools, or whatever their culture war issue was, that now the congregations are demanding more kind of tribal politics stuff from their clergy. And they don't feel safe being like, well, no, I don't want to use a church van to go to January 6th. Or like, I'm not going to say like X, Y, and Z about Israel. Or where I get clergy messaging me going like, what do I do? My whole retirement plan and family's life insurance, health insurance is all tied up to being an American Baptist. And now my congregation is telling me, why aren't you going to take a stand for Israel? Or why aren't you, stand for American elections or whatever? And so is there something to be learned or gained a kind of wisdom in thinking about these past times where you get these kind of shift in religious identities for how both leaders and lay people navigate that tension?
I think you're absolutely right that this has accelerated, gotten worse. COVID was really tough. The shortening of attention spans, the ratcheting up of political identity, the total war, culture wars stuff, which really has come from one side and not the other. This is weaponized on one side, and the other side just trying to figure out how to swim in these shark infested waters. It's not unprecedented. Very few things are, that like you clergy person need to take a stand, and it's got to be this one, and it's got to be vocal or else. I'm reminded of racial integration in the mid 20th century, where it was similar. There's an amazing documentary, A Time for Burning, I believe is the title, about a Lutheran pastor it's been a while since I looked at it. I want to say Kansas City. I should have the details, but he wants to do just an exchange with a local Black church of the same denomination. Like, what if some of us go to their worship service and some of them come to ours? And this is in the North. It's not like in Birmingham, Alabama. It's in the North. And he tries it, and like his whole church blows up because people are uncomfortable and they can't imagine getting dragged into this social stance. And then also people saying, but you're not doing it enough. And then Black people in town saying, we're just so sick of hearing about their white Christianity. Like, we can't trust them at all. So in some ways, there's so much pressure to take the right stance and embody it in the right way. In some ways, this is something that particularly Black Americans have known forever and have experienced forever. But now the fault line runs between white people, and white people are having to reckon with it in a different way. So the slavery issue split churches and was super fraught in the early 19th century. So there is precedent for some kind of political issue, social justice issue, people's actual lives on the line issue being very high stakes within churches, including white churches in this country. There are, I would say, more issues now. There's probably less patience now. And denominational identity has been eroding. Robert Withnow has been writing about this, the two-party system in 20th century Protestant and Catholic, and Jewish, actually, that liberal Catholics, Protestants, and Jews have more in common with each other than they do with conservatives of their own church tradition. So if denominational identity means so much less than political and theological orientation and on seemingly every issue all the time, and nobody's going to give any grace to someone who takes a different stance, then yeah, it's definitely a formula for a lot of congregational tension, a lot of clergy burnout, a lot of institutional struggle, something that we've seen before, but more of it everywhere in every direction all the time.
There are some mainline Protestants who, joke that, well, part of mainline Protestants' problem is that they won, that like the inclusion of women or, the different ethical stances that were initially controversial for mainline Protestants, be it, their role in the social gospel movement through, inclusion or gender parity, those kinds of things and such. All of those places get to where like the moral content or the voice of mainline Protestantism ends up winning, and it's normative, maybe until relatively recently. And so then you show up at a mainline Protestant church, or the kids do, and they're like, well, what is it that matters to us that just doesn't matter to the rest of our friends and their kids who just have humanities degrees? How do you see that? Because I hear a version of that spoken of on a regular, like assumed on a regular basis. And the other related to mainline Protestant thing that comes out is, oh, well, the real reason they went downhill was because they were supportive, they were critical of Vietnam and supportive of integration. And so since so many white Christians are deep down racist, militarist, they're like, well, Billy Graham will let us become evangelical, and so we can still go to war and be racist.
Honestly, I would say that the explanation you just gave is more accurate than the previous one. The mainline declined because they won. Sociological versions of that is about like tension with surrounding culture. Is there an optimal tension? If you're too angular to the surrounding culture, then you're going to be some group like Mennonite or Amish, like a lot of internal cohesion and super high tension with the rest of the culture. But if you blend in with the rest of the culture too much, then there's no reason why anybody would join your movement. There's no reason why anybody would stay. The boundaries are too porous and squishy. That was a dominant theory of American religious dynamics for a while. Jay Demarath, Chris Smith had some stuff about that. More recently, David Hollinger, a book about why the bulk of American Christianity is so right-leaning now. He was like, no, those churches, evangelical churches, even fundamentalist churches will say, we're really doing the hard work here. Like we're standing against the culture. We're the tough Christians against those wishy-washy. Yeah, but you're letting your people not reckon with racism. You're letting your people not reckon with other kinds of difference. You're letting people punt on environmental issues and economic issues. Like you say you're doing the tough stuff, you're making it so easy for them to dodge the really hard questions of our time. And I think he's absolutely right about that. It is hard to pursue racial justice. It is hard to figure out what to do with environmental crises. It is hard to figure out how to have a functioning democratic process with people who you don't agree with at all. And whatever it is that right-leaning churches say that they're against the culture on, which is usually what, like trans athletes and other, like, those are tiny issues. You say you're being tough. You're being it's the swallowing a camel and straining at a gnat things. Like, no, there is hard stuff going on. And unfortunately, the religious people who are trying to do the hard things well, people, like, you're not going to have mass appeal if what you're telling people is the world is hard. Us figuring out our role in it is going to be hard. It's going to be really depleting. Let's try to do the best we can. Are you going to go to that church that's honest with you about that? Or are you going to go to the church that tells you that we have it all figured out? Our people are the best and God wants us to win. Most people are going to choose the second. And that is what the allegedly hard work of Christianity is pitching them right now.
Yeah, I think the too much time in critical theory classes leads one to go like, well, I just wouldn't trust anyone that's that optimistic and cheery and about the option. But I definitely think quite a few people respond to it. When you see stuff like those different cultural issues showing up, where kind of the momentary expression of tribal identity set up the battling lines, and then you as a historian, like, what is it like to provide nuance to it or framing to it? Like, or you can pick a different one, but like knowing how, now that I'm moved back to North Carolina, reconnecting with all my Baptists, my family have been Baptist for a long time and in leadership and stuff. And then I was out of the South for an extended period of time, but coming back, the number of old school Baptists, like before the takeover and things, who are all posting on their social media their hot takes about whatever the funding thing happened at Baylor. Because in Baptist life, Baylor and Wake Forest universities were at one point, when I was at Wake Forest, it was like these two different ways of being Baptist, historically Baptist universities and institutions. Like, oh, like y'all have a active member requirement, for faculty, versus at Wake Forest that doesn't happen, or these kind of things. And even when they started div schools, it took different shapes about the roles of different Baptist life. Part of it was the state denominations broke out differently at different times, but that kind of thing. But I know in the turning points thing, you talk about that contested center of Protestantism, where like the Billy Graham and Christianity Today, Christian Century thing was there. And there's this kind of energetic force that pushes to kind of crystallize positions. And it seems the logic behind kind of Baylor, like not taking money and stuff, is trying to occupy a middle ground that pleases no one. I tend to think that's kind of like what the CBF does about everything, but yeah. But like when you see those kind of energies at play, what from your historical background shows up to go, well, let's think about this kind of touch point or energetic moment of tribal identity by looking at patterns when we've done it well or poorly in the past as a church engaging the public square.
Yeah, I don't know if all historians are as discouraging as I am. I could show you lots of more ways of things going wrong in history
Oh yeah.
than like resources to draw on. I think some of the things that I think about when I'm trying to figure out what resources come from the past in my study of the past. I know that as a highly educated, middle class white woman, and also not just categorically, but like who I am, like I want to solve problems efficiently. And I look at the really big problem. I've been part of a mass effort this week to try to keep a local man who was wrongfully detained from being swept up into ICE custody. And we lost. They took him yesterday. And my impression is like, well, that's just wrong. That like we need to fix this. Like we're shaking my tiny fists at it. But then I think about Black Christian in the 19th century or the 20th century, or now they don't expect things to get fixed. It doesn't mean they don't try. It's amazing that they keep trying, even though they can't expect things to get fixed. A certain kind of patience and humility and some other reserve of energy to keep doing something other than being able to check off the wins. That's something that I get from a resource from the past. With the contested center thing in the Christian Century book, again, a very young Martin Marty back in the 50s, early 60s said, we in the didn't have it wasn't the Mainline yet. He thought they should be able to call themselves evangelical. That ship sailed. It's the contesting for the cultural center that's gonna steer us wrong. That we need to tactically retreat from that. We need to be a moral minority. We need to be a creative force. We need to not turn into our enemies, and we need to just recalibrate who we are and what's possible here. I don't know the Baylor thing, which there's a lot I don't know about that. I don't know what choices our administration like realistically had in that moment. The center that pleases no one is a crappy place to be, but I'm in Texas. And I used to think that the biggest pressure on this institution was going to come from its Baptist heritage. But look at the pressures that the Texas legislature is putting on the public schools. Like, again, realistically, what options are there when you're trying to protect not just an institution and a brand and like things that I can, in my darker moments, be like, yeah, just board it down. Just like board it down. If it's not just an institution and a brand, it's your people. What do you realistically do in that moment? This is why I would never even want to be an administrator. I want to be able to shake my tiny fists and go to my protests as just a regular citizen and try to figure out what I can manage for myself and my family. I would not want to be responsible for a congregation, university. It's too hard. I wish I had better advice for those folks, but it's just I can't. I don't know how they. I don't know. I got nothing. I can't help. I will try to support. But I can't tell you how to find a path through this right now.
This is tangentially related to where we were, but what I forgot to ask this earlier because it was on my list. One of the things you talk about in the Turning Points book is the Great Awakening, the first one, and where you talk about George Whitefield and in the kind of the rule it functioned to kind of give a religious identity to the emerging American nation, and there you get two Great Awakenings depending on the historian. Some call the social gospel movement a third one, where you get a kind of shared religious movement across the normal denominational lines and this kind of thing. But when you see the role these different kind of movements play, and then look at like the biggest shift in religion in the last 25 years, the rise of the nones, what role do you imagine religion playing if there's kind of energetic eruptions of renewal when Protestantism or Christianity writ large plays a different role to the public than it has for, most of American church history?
For most of American history, the mid 20th century is a really anomalous time if you want to look at formal church membership. That is a long story of rise and fall. There was a lot of irreligion around the time of the alleged Second Great Awakening. Historians are now saying that never even happened, that was a later label attached to a period that was far more complicated than that, and that a lot of people were not involved in. Social gospel now being seen by some, though not all, as a middle position pleasing none. That the real promise was in the labor movement and labor Christianity, which got shut down by the Federal Council of Churches saying, no, we will occupy the middle position and solve these problems for you. So renewal movements have always had complicated legacies that didn't touch everyone. They created new boundaries while erasing others. So anything that would happen again would be that again. And possibly on a smaller scale because fewer people identify as religious, although a ton of people didn't identify as religious at the time of the First Great Awakening in the early 18th century either. We hear about the ones who were part of that. We don't hear as much about the woodshed Christians or the people who just stayed on the farm rather than going to hear the itinerant evangelist because they couldn't imagine why it would matter. My current thought of how any kind of religious renewal might affect the country right now, and here I'm looking at possible reorientation of American Catholicism on the issue with immigration rather than being so single issue focused on abortion. And not all American Catholics were, but enough of them were that part of our current political party alignment is who can Republicans count on 100%? What if they couldn't count on all of those populations 100%? What kind of our current political alignment is still so tied to the Republican Southern strategy of the 60s and 70s, post-civil rights. So you have all these really angry white racists. Who are they going to vote for? How much can we court the angry white racist vote? That has produced a real stranglehold. Is there any way that shifts within religious bodies in the United States could break that stranglehold? I don't know what order would emerge from that, but if there's some kind of enough renewal, enough reorientation, enough breaking apart of the idea that if I believe this about the Bible, then I must also vote this party. Can we break that open enough to have some kind of realignment? I would be thrilled if we could have that, which probably seems like a much more modest goal than a revival of religion, but I can't imagine a grander one being even remotely possible.
Yeah. So you think if you do another edition of the Turning Point book in, say, 20 years, one of the newest edition will be the election of the first American Pope, or something related to the rise of Christian nationalism, or the prevalence of the nuns? I was trying to think of in my head, my game of, oh, I write a new chapter and expand something in 20 or 30 years. Like, which one do you think will be the most tempting?
I think nuns. I think that that's the trajectory that we were on. And I already have a path to that mapped out in that last chapter, The Rise of the Religious Right, because there is some solid information that when the religion that you think of first, when you think of American Christianity, to circle back to our earlier part of this conversation, when it's reactionary Christian nationalism, and a lot of people are saying, if that's Christianity, then I don't want it. Then telling the story of the rise of the religious right is also alluding to the story of the nuns. However, the pandemic might be as much of a turning point in that story. If we lose a bunch of immigration, like the lifeblood of a lot of American churches, predominantly Catholic and Pentecostal, has been immigration. The majority of immigrants are Christians. If that stops, then those two things, the pandemic and the immigration crackdown, that becomes your turning point. Why 20 years from now is American Christianity as diminished as it has been in Europe? We were on that path for a while. There are multiple reasons why church attendance and membership were on kind of a glide path down already. But certainly those two things, if we persist on the track we're right now, that would be the big downturn.
Thinking of that changing religious landscape, how do, as a scholar and then a university with a distinctly Christian identity, how does that change the way you think about both the role within the guild and the public facing role of academics and their larger institutions for the marketplace, right? Like, I could imagine all sorts of different responses running through my head And just think of how many Baptists were like, well, I'm not that kind of Baptist, right? Like where you have to give that kind of speech. And that's just when you're thinking about being Baptist, say in the South or in Texas or something like that. But when you think of as a historian and then as a university, how does the decline of Christianity change what it means to be a public scholar or a university addressing a public from a particular tradition?
Yeah. A lot of Christian colleges moved hard right in the last 10, 20 years as a marketing distinctive as much as anything else. My first teaching institution in southwestern Pennsylvania did that. They decided that what was going to be distinctive was to be in the Hillsdale, Liberty, Grove City, more like stridently Republican and also Christian. I mean, apologies to anyone who's in those institutions and would dispute that characterization. But like from a branding standpoint, that's kind of the territory that they staked out. Assuming that the middle is not going to appeal to anyone, you got to go one way or another. And they went hard, right? Very, very few Christian institutions tried to move more left. I think there's probably a space for, a solid couple, three of those, but maybe not more than that. An institution like Baylor that's also R1, that also has the sports, that also that's a little bit more like a Notre Dame or Wake Forest and Duke. Like they made those decisions earlier. But I mean, the thing among the crises we're thinking about in higher ed, arguably the biggest one right now isn't the political pressure, it's the AI thing. Are there going to be schools that say, we're not AI? The way that if there are classical schools at the elementary school level now, like our kids aren't on screens, they read books, and we're going to teach them Latin. I think that there's going to be a space in higher ed for schools like that. And some of them will be Christian. They will say that we're about formation of the whole person. We care, like human dignity is what we believe in more than anything else. And among the things about that is we're going to do humanities in a non-AI flooded way. I don't know. Maybe that's just me dreaming that there will be other ways to stake out an institutional identity other than we're exactly this kind of Baptist. And I think a lot of institutions are going to try a lot of things. My alma mater, Wheaton College, certainly trying to decide what to do. They surveyed their alumni after yet another which side are we on politically thing with our alumnus Russ Vaught in the Trump administration. And basically Wheaton found that, and this isn't by era exactly, a third of their alumni think they're too conservative, a third of their alumni think they're too liberal, and a third of their alumni think they're fine. Like, what do you do with that as an institutional leader? I don't know. Good luck with that.
Well, and they probably have people in all three categories that go to the same church. I mean, I think that's one of those weird things about our cultural moment is the like. I mean, that is true. I think of when I just think of all the alumni of any of the schools I went to. Your experience of that school can be something you deeply value, and you're like, yeah, and I was the crazy one on campus, or I was the most orthodox person there, or I got to be the minority voice in all the arguments, or like sometimes people value something being its thing, even if they don't cohere with it completely.
They're able to do that with colleges and with churches from the
Yeah.
statistical information that I've seen. And that may change too, but it's part of it. I think it's nostalgia. Like it has less of an impact on your daily life than what congregation you're part of. People are going to sort themselves out more at the congregational level while still retaining some older loyalties at the college level.
About Margaret Mead, can you say something about her and what it was like discovering her to become a whole subject of a book?
Yeah, I was invited to write that book. Tim Larson at Wheaton, who at the time I did not know, was editing a series for Oxford Press on the spiritual lives. I mean, that was the name of the series, Spiritual Lives series, but he conceived it as the spiritual lives of people who are famous for something other than being spiritual. Lots of people, if they remember anything about Margaret Mead at all, remember that she was an anthropologist and like she wrote about teen sex, which is true. She was also a nearly lifelong Episcopalian who was involved with the National Council of Churches and the World Council of Churches. She consulted on the revision to the Book of Common Prayer for the Episcopal Church in the 70s. She has a whole book of essays that are, whether you want to call it theology or not, depends on how you boundary keep that term, but certainly theological reflections. Yeah, and it was fascinating. I knew nothing about her when Larson asked me to write about her, but he knew it would be a good fit for the series, and she was Mainline, and it was a woman, and I think he wanted a woman author, and I think probably Mark Knoll gave him my name, so he just emailed me out of the blue saying, "Hey, I'm doing this series. Would you be willing to write on Margaret Mead?" And so I looked her up on Wikipedia. I'm like, I don't know, sure, because she's absolutely fascinating, very messy, complicated personal life, very fast and sprawling professional life. The Margaret Mead Papers and South Pacific Ethnographic Collection that she helped put together is the largest collection in the Library of Congress. Nobody could possibly fathom everything that she worked on, but also nobody had written about her as a religious figure at all. So I had, for complicated tenure reasons, like 2 weeks in the archive and 2 years start to finish to learn about this person and write an Oxford Press book on her. And it ended up being a pandemic project, but really, really has shaped my thinking about how humans work and how religion overlays that, and when people are fighting, what are the ways to understand those conflicts. I'm just really glad that I was asked to do that, and really glad I had a chance to.
Yeah, yeah, and her, I mean, I'm most familiar with her as an anthropologist, but I don't know why in my head I know she got really, like, later in life became much more smitten with her Episcopalian religious practice. But like, what did you learn about her own, like, how her vocation as an anthropologist shaped the way she even understood her own religious faith and practice? Like when you get to know how Mead practiced her own faith, are there particular features that make more sense because she was an anthropologist and had this kind of attention to the way different cultural phenomena and practices generate social function and bonding and those kind of things?
The most concrete way that her anthropological training was relevant to her religious work was her focus on adolescence and ritual. That's why she was tapped to help with the revisions to the Book of Common Prayer for the Episcopal Church, because they wanted to talk about baptism as a ritual that happens early in a person's life. And so she circulated a white paper to the committee. She's like, depending on which meeting you were looking at for this liturgical standing committee, one of or the only woman and one of or the only non-ordained person. So as I was able to recreate this from the records, it's her in a room full of Episcopal priests, her having these big ideas like, if you want to be able to cross the generational divide, maybe we should have some people under 35 in these conversations. Oh, no, we don't know any and we can't have that. Okay. Well, let's think about the human lifespan. It's so much longer than it used to be. And like, they're not born and die in the same town. What if the church had rituals to sacralize these things that, like, moving to a new town, not just getting married, but also getting divorced? What about retirement? What about taking on a new job? We asked you whether the bishop should still say this line in the baptismal formula or not. Oh, okay. She and her daughter drafted a whole alternate liturgy for baptism that was used for Mead's granddaughter, I believe, and never used by anyone ever again. It's just in the Episcopal archives down in Austin. So the ritual aspects, and particularly about adolescence and life transition. She was also very interested in aging and menopause and views of marriage, in part because she was married and divorced 3 times, but also her anthropological vocation and how this worked with her church work. She was part of the U.S. World War II effort, trying to keep up morale on she was lots of anthropologists got enlisted, both for like, how can we understand these cultures we're fighting against in order to undermine them, but also how do we keep U.S. morale up? And as U.S. forces are occupying territories that they've recaptured, how do we feed these people? How do we organize these people? We need some cross-cultural abilities just to wage this war in ideally an ethical way. And then there was the nuclear bombs at the end of the war. And she wrote that she had another book written and she destroyed it. I think that was a bit of an overstatement. But from the rest of her life, then she's trying to figure out, okay, this is what I know about humans and human societies and human conflicts. We now have a very real ability to destroy human life, both with the nuclear stuff and with environmental degradation. She was very concerned about environmental issues early on. Like, now that we have the capability not just to kill that raiding party from the next village over, but to kill everybody, how do we marshal all of our resources, religious and otherwise, to try to keep that from happening? And that's a really big task. And she used all of her energies in every direction she could think of. And some of her projects seem pretty quixotic, like we should have more conferences with coffee. And some of them are much bigger and grander than that. But like, it's hard to argue with the goal. Let's stop killing each other. Let's do whatever it takes to not do that.
Denominational reflections, say like on liturgy or thinking about the role of religion in the public square and all that kind of stuff, there tends to be genuine gifts when we think about how religion functions using other disciplines. And oftentimes the more conservative the tradition is theologically, the more it's kind of allergic to thinking about, a social scientific account or an anthropological account or an evolutionary account of X, Y, and Z from it. And it is how do you see incorporating other disciplines in fruitful ways when teaching, say, religious history, to kind of address or maybe like destigmatize that kind of interdisciplinary work for students in the classroom?
The example that comes to mind first was an adult education class at the church I used to attend, a Presbyterian church. And this is here in Waco, and there were a bunch of faculty who went to this church. And devising a adult Sunday school class that would look at a biblical passage for like 3 weeks running, the same passage. And it would be led by somebody with training in English, somebody with training in Bible and theology, and somebody with training in history. And we chose passages that those different disciplines really brought different things to the table on. We also looked at how those passages were illustrated in art, maybe how they influenced law, or how we did this for, I think we got through 4 passages, maybe 5 passages before the class was over. And that, I think, that's a great example of bringing into a church space. So it's clearly not hostile. These are people from your church, but like, oh, when somebody with an English PhD reads this passage, these are the things that they think about, and these are the questions that they ask, and this is what it looks like to them, and just enlarging that conversation. There was another class going on that was led by science professors. So we weren't like blocking that out from this class. We could have brought 8 or 10 different academic, like if everybody was going to the same class rather than there was already the science and faith one. So this ended up being more like the people who were interested in humanities. And certainly Christian higher education done well shows that these different disciplines, they are different. And the people practicing them are different. But anybody going through Baylor should know that they don't have anything to fear from sociology or physics or history or you name it. Like, they've seen that all these people who they know have in common membership in a Christian or Jewish faith community, and yet are doing all this different kind of work. So yeah, the two examples that I've been involved with that I think should be helping people understand that a range of expertise is healthy for them as Christians and for the church as a whole.
Awesome. Well, one last thing that comes to mind is you mentioned an email working currently on a history of the RNS, the Religion News Service. Maybe just give us a little teaser of what's there, and maybe what's interesting as a historian of you did Christian Century, you've worked at other publications, but the Religious News Service is a very different kind of organization and has its history. So maybe give us the origin story of it so we can be looking forward to what happens when the work comes out.
The origin of my interest in it was back when I was working on the Christian Century book. I wanted a picture of the convening convention of the National Conference of Churches in 1950. I had seen this picture published somewhere else. It's a bunch of dudes in a room under this giant banner saying "One Nation Under God." You don't think of the Mainline as Christian nationalists, but I mean, like, that's the image. I just wanted the picture for my book. And the credit line was Religion News Service Collection, Presbyterian Historical Society, Philadelphia. I was in Princeton for the year on a research fellowship. I thought, I will pop down to Philly. I will get this picture. I can put it in my book. And I discovered on that trip that the Religion News Service Collection is not as big as the meat collection of the Library of Congress I would later work with, but one of the biggest at the Presbyterian Historical Society. It is 624 banker boxes. And they had it there since 1983, and it was still mostly unprocessed when I was there in 2012. It took me half a day to find my picture. I found a bunch of other pictures. I don't know if you remember the pictures of all the Christian Century staff guys in that book. Those were in the RNS collection. Those were not in the Christian Century offices. I did not know
Oh,
what
wow.
those guys looked like, but I stumbled across the pictures because it was so hard to find what I was looking for in this other collection. But I thought the collection was fabulous. The Religion News Service was launched in 1933. It's still going, but it has changed hands a bunch of times since 1983. So the archive in Philly is pretty much just that 50-year record. They were putting out as many as 50 news stories a day for a while, talking about religious topics within the US and abroad. They had hundreds of correspondents feeding them information. They launched a photo service in 1945. So there's thousands of historic images of religious people and events and places. And I just thought after that one day looking for one picture, like, I want to write about this. But I thought, I'll wait till they process the collection more because this is just kind of overwhelming. And then I came back to it once I was tenured and had my second book, full professor. Like, I can take longer on projects. The processing had not really progressed at all. They do have some grant funding to digitize some of the images. So there's going to be 60,000, a bunch of images that are coming online. You can already see some of those. But the text files, both the record of what RNS was publishing and then the research files that they maintained, because this is before Google. So if you're trying to edit a news story and it's about some bishop in Romania and you want to check, wait a minute, how's that place spelled? Who was the bishop there before him? Which religious tradition is that? You had to have your own files on all of that. And so there's hundreds of boxes that were their research files, the morgue in newspaper parlance. And it's also a fascinating organization. The founding editor was a Jewish immigrant, a Russian Jewish immigrant who his family was Russian Jewish. He had been born in England, who just walked into the offices of this guy at the Federal Council of Churches and was like, I think you ought to have a news service. Like, I'm literally trying to figure that out right now. The evidence is fragmentary and it doesn't make a lot of sense. The second managing editor, also a Jewish woman. So like all your church news for the church pages of metro dailies across the country in the 40s and 50s were coming out of this little office in New York with two Jewish editors. And it's just, as a former journalist and as someone who is interested in all aspects of religion, particularly mainline, progressive, let's help society be more cohesive kind of religion, it's just a fascinating institutional story, as well as touching on all these other topics. And nobody's written about it at all, in part because the archive has not been useful. So both making that archive more useful to other researchers and getting the story out there. So when people encounter RNS historical stuff, they kind of know where it came from, what its limitations were, like I did with the Christian Century. Like, these were the people behind that thing that you found in your archival collection. So if you want to use that, then you know better what it means.
That's really cool. That's really cool. It sounds like nerdy fun.
I love archives. So yeah, it is nerdy.
Do you like the smell of archives? Because they have a distinct smell sometimes.
I can have several. I've had ledgers in a leaky basement room of a building on the University of Chicago, like falling apart on my clothes. That wasn't great. I get newsprint ink on my fingers a lot in Philadelphia, and it's really, you have to go really far to wash your hands and come back. But overall, yeah, there's nothing like cracking open a folder that nobody's looked at in decades and being like, "Oh, gosh, I can't believe what's in here."
Yeah. I did a presentation once because when I was at Claremont, you have the archives for the Center for Process Studies, which has all the early process philosophers like exchange letters, like Hartshorne wrote a letter to so-and-so or whatever, which that is why Mead sticks out. She was friends with Whitehead. They have exchanges. That's what the connection point, because she liked his lecture series, Religion in the Making.
Mhm.
Okay, now that's all popping in my head why I have any reference point for that when you mentioned it. Okay, but the when I had letters of ditto paper, there's a certain smell ditto paper has, and Charles Hartshorne had used ditto paper the last time he was giving a whole series of lectures of when he would do the class. And so there's like the ditto paper version of his lectures the last time he taught a bunch of classes there, and it just has a scent, and I'm like, oh, it's a smell of hartshorn, and it's just like a certain aesthetic thing. And anyway, sorry, those is but like the smell of certain. I mean, I know what the library smells like in all the places, and like if you used it regularly, you know what the library smells like on the floor that has the books you used all the time. It was my work study throughout school was library because I always have fun doing it. But that's exciting. Plus, when you get done doing it, every time anyone has to check your book because you organize it and told the whole backstory. Talk about just the number of footnote shout outs you'll get anytime people use R&S stuff in the future. I mean, that's
Yeah.
pretty
I mean, the
exciting.
Christian Century book still gets, because anybody who's wants to quote the century in historical work, like that was part of why I wrote that whole thing. Like the library collections of the Christian Century, it is held in way more libraries than religious periodicals that had 10, 20, 50 times its circulation. Bridal Call, which was Amy Semple McPherson's periodical, huge circulation. Last time I checked, it's in 4 libraries. So researchers are not coming across that. They're not using that. Every divinity school library has a run of the Christian Century. It's digitized fairly well back to like 1917. So yeah, it comes up in research all the time. And ideally, anytime you're using an archival body, you understand, was it speaking to or for? What was the circulation? Where did it come from? What is the nature of this source? Yeah, because I love archives, I love to make archival stuff more useful and more responsibly useful to other researchers.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to chat. Is there anything I should have asked you about or is missing?
I don't think so.
Okay. Good. Good. Well, because once I got interested in talking to you, then I really derailed my script of topics.
Well, and I kept not exactly answering the questions that you asked either. So it was a group project.
Well, I really appreciate it, and let me know when the book comes out. It'll be fun to check it out and let people know about it.
Yeah, it'll be a while, but our articles should be coming out and presentations and stuff.
Awesome. Cool.
Okay, nice meeting you.